The crystalline spires of Nexus Station glinted like frozen lightning against the void of space. Ambassador Thomas Reed adjusted his collar for the 100th time as his shuttle approached the diplomatic hub. After 15 years in the Interstellar Diplomatic Corps, this was supposed to be a routine meeting with the Vesperians, a newly discovered spacefaring species known for their strict social protocols and remarkable technological achievements. The Vesperian delegation had requested this meeting to discuss trade routes through their sector. Simple enough, Reed thought. He'd done this dance countless times before. The shuttle docked with barely a shudder, a testament to the station's advanced technology. As he stepped into the arrival chamber, his breath caught at the sight of the welcoming party. 3 Vesperian representatives stood waiting, their iridescent scales shifting colors in the station's artificial light. Their elongated features and graceful movements gave them an almost ethereal quality. The tallest of them, clearly the leader, stepped forward with fluid grace. "Welcome, Ambassador Reed. I am First Speaker Nirala," she said, her universal translator rendering her musical language into crisp English. "These are my sisters, Second Speaker Solara and Third Speaker Vena." Reed bowed precisely to the depth specified in his cultural briefing. "The pleasure is mine, First Speaker. Earth's United Council sends their warmest regards." What happened next would later be described in diplomatic reports as the incident. As Reed straightened from his bow, a maintenance drone malfunctioned overhead, dropping several meters before its backup systems engaged. The sudden movement caused everyone to step back instinctively, everyone except Reed and First Speaker Nirala. Their hands brushed as they collided, and Nirala's scales flashed a brilliant azure. The other Vesperians gasped. Reed knew immediately something had gone terribly wrong, though he couldn't have guessed just how wrong. "Ambassador," Nirala said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you understand what you have just done?" "I apologize for the collision, First Speaker. It was entirely unintentional." Reed's diplomatic training kicked in, already formulating ways to smooth over this cultural faux pas. Second Speaker Solara stepped forward, her scales pulsing with what Reed would later learn was amusement. "Brother, you misunderstand. By initiating physical contact with First Speaker Nirala during a formal introduction, you have activated one of our most sacred traditions." Reed's stomach dropped. "Sacred traditions? Among our people," Third Speaker Vena explained, her tone formal but her scales flickering with suppressed mirth, "such contact during a diplomatic meeting is considered a proposal of eternal partnership." "A proposal of?" Reed's diplomatic poker face cracked. "You mean marriage?" "Indeed," Nirala confirmed, her scales now shifting through a complex pattern of blues and purples. "According to laws that predate our space age, we are now bound to complete the unity ceremony within one orbital cycle, or both our peoples will lose all honor in the galactic community." Reed's mind raced through the implications. Earth needed this trade agreement. The Vesperian routes would cut years off interstellar travel times. If he refused, he'd not only create an interstellar incident but potentially set human expansion back decades. Surely there must be some alternative, he asked, already knowing the answer from the way the Vesperian sisters' scales synchronized into a deep, serious purple. "There is not," Nirala stated. "However, Ambassador Thomas, you should know that this has never happened in our history with any other species. Perhaps the celestial winds have guided us to this moment for a reason." As station officials rushed to contain the diplomatic chaos erupting around them, Reed realized his routine trade mission had just become something far more complex. He'd have to navigate not only interstellar politics but also an unexpected marriage to an alien leader who, despite her apparent composure, seemed just as startled by this turn of events as he was. Looking at Nirala's shifting scales and proud bearing, Reed couldn't help but wonder if this accident might lead to something more significant than any trade agreement. But first, he'd have to figure out how to explain to Earth's United Council why their chief diplomat was about to become the first human to marry a Vesperian First Speaker. The next 24 hours on Nexus Station were a blur of cultural advisors, diplomatic communiques, and increasingly bewildered officials from both species. Ambassador Reed sat in his temporary quarters, staring at the holographic display showing Earth's United Council's response to his situation. Absolutely not. Counselor Bennett's voice crackled through the quantum link. We cannot have our chief diplomat bound by alien marriage laws. There must be a way to annul this. With all due respect, Counselor, Reed replied, maintaining his composure. Refusing would be catastrophic for Earth-Vesperian relations. Their culture values honor above all else. Breaking a unity bond would be seen as the gravest possible insult. Then we'll send another diplomat dash. The Vesperians would never trust us again, Reed interrupted. We'd lose the trade routes, the technology exchange agreements, everything we've worked towards for the past decade. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime at his door. First speaker Nirala entered, her scales now a subtle pattern of silver and gold that Reed was beginning to recognize as their formal diplomatic colors. She moved with characteristic grace, though he noticed a slight tension in her movements. Ambassador, she said, then corrected herself. Thomas. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, first speaker. The council was just expressing their concerns about our situation. Nirala's scales flickered briefly with what might have been amusement. As are my own people. The Great Assembly has been in session for hours, debating the implications of our impending union. The holographic Counselor Bennett cleared his throat. First speaker, surely you understand our position. This entire situation stems from a cultural misunderstanding. Does it? Nirala's scales shifted to a deep, thoughtful blue. Our histories speak of the celestial winds guiding destinies. Perhaps this misunderstanding serves a greater purpose. Reed found himself studying her features, the elegant curve of her crest, the way her scales caught the light. Despite their physiological differences, there was something undeniably beautiful about her presence. The Unity ceremony preparations have begun, Nirala continued. Thomas, would you join me? There are aspects of our customs you should understand. After disconnecting from the increasingly frustrated council, Reed followed Nirala through the station's crystalline corridors. They entered a vast chamber he hadn't seen before, its walls covered in shifting patterns that seemed to respond to their presence. This is the Chamber of Harmonies, Nirala explained. In our culture, unity isn't just about two individuals joining. It's about the harmonization of entire life patterns. She gestured, and the wall patterns coalesced into complex mathematical equations. These represent the fundamental frequencies of our beings. The unity ceremony aligns these patterns, creating a resonance that affects not just us, but our entire species. Reed's diplomatic training kicked in as he began to understand. You're saying this ceremony has actual, measurable effects on your people? Yes. And now, for the first time, we'll attempt it with a human participant. Nirala's scales shifted to a color he'd never seen before. Our scientists are fascinated by the possibilities. Your species' neural patterns are unique in our experience. As they discussed the ceremony's implications, Reed found himself drawn into deep conversation with Nirala. They talked about their respective cultures, their hopes for their peoples, and their personal beliefs. Hours passed unnoticed. You're not what I expected, Nirala admitted as their discussion wound down. When the contact happened, I feared this would be a diplomatic disaster. But you've shown remarkable adaptability. You've surprised me too, Reed replied honestly. I never imagined an accidental touch could lead to this. But I'm beginning to think maybe it wasn't entirely accidental. Nirala's scales rippled with a pattern he was starting to recognize as pleased surprise. Oh. The drone malfunction, the precise timing of our collision. The odds seem rather convenient, don't they? Are you suggesting someone engineered this situation? Her scales flickered with interest. Let's just say I've learned to be skeptical of coincidences in diplomatic settings. Reed smiled. Though I have to admit, as diplomatic crises go, this one has its advantages. Their conversation was interrupted by second speaker Solara, who entered with an air of urgency. First speaker, Ambassador, we have a problem. The Concordiate has learned of our situation, and they're demanding immediate involvement in the ceremony. Reed recognized the name. The Concordiate was a rival alien federation that had been trying to establish influence in this sector for years. Their involvement could complicate an already delicate situation. Nirala's scales darkened with concern. They have no right to intervene in our cultural practices. They claim that a human Vesperian union threatens the balance of power in the sector, Solara reported. Their fleet is already on the move. Reed and Nirala exchanged glances. What had begun as a cultural misunderstanding was rapidly evolving into a potential interstellar crisis. Yet somehow, as Reed looked at Nirala's determined expression, he felt oddly confident. Together, they might just be able to transform this crisis into an opportunity for both their peoples. The Concordiate's ultimatum arrived just as Reed and Nirala were reviewing the Unity ceremony protocols. The holographic message materialized in a chamber of harmonies, displaying the stern visage of High Marshal Drakath, his crystalline exoskeleton gleaming with barely contained aggression. This unauthorized union cannot proceed, the Marshal declared. The joining of human and Vesperian bloodlines would destabilize centuries of carefully maintained genetic hierarchies. You have 6 standard hours to cancel the ceremony, or we will be forced to take preventative measures. After the transmission ended, Reed watched Nirala's scales cycle through a complex pattern of colors he'd never seen before. I take it that's not a good sign. Those patterns indicate preparations for war, Solara explained, her own scales shifting to match her sister's. The last time a first speaker displayed such colors, our fleet engaged in the Battle of the Seventh Nebula. The Concordiate has always feared our potential alliance with humanity, Nirala said, her voice carrying an edge Reed hadn't heard before. This ceremony would bind our peoples together in ways their political maneuvering never could. Reed's diplomatic instincts kicked in. Then perhaps that's exactly why it should proceed. But first, tell me everything about these genetic hierarchies they mentioned. Over the next hour, Nirala and her sisters revealed a complex web of interstellar politics. The Concordiate had maintained their power by keeping various species separated, preventing the kind of deep cultural and biological exchanges that could lead to meaningful alliances. Their claim of genetic hierarchy was merely a convenient excuse to maintain their dominance. Our scientists have long theorized that human neural patterns could enhance our resonance capabilities, third speaker Vena explained, bringing up detailed biological displays. The Concordiate fears this because enhanced resonance could break their control over the quantum communication networks. And they're willing to start a war to prevent this? Reed asked, though he already knew the answer. They're willing to start a war because they know they'll lose their advantage if they don't, Nirala responded. Her scales had settled into a determined pattern of deep blues and violets. The question is, Thomas, are you willing to continue with the ceremony knowing what's at stake? Reed stood at the chamber's viewport, watching as distant lights signaled the arrival of Concordiate warships. He thought about Earth, about the Vesperian people, and about the woman beside him whose alien beauty had somehow become familiar and dear to him. I don't think we have a choice, he said finally. If we back down now, the Concordiate wins. They'll use this victory to push both our peoples into submission. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've grown rather fond of the idea of our union. Nirala's scales flushed with a warm golden hue that made Reed's heart skip a beat. But before she could respond, alarms blared throughout the station. Multiple quantum space ruptures detected. Solara announced, her technical interfaces flashing with data. The Concordiate isn't waiting for their deadline. They're launching an attack. The station shuddered as the first wave of enemy fire struck its shields. Reed watched in amazement as Nirala's scales began emanating patterns that seemed to strengthen the very fabric of space around them. "The resonance chamber," she said urgently. "If we begin the ceremony now, while I'm in contact with the station's defensive systems, it could either save us all or tear reality apart," Venna warned. "The combination of human neural patterns and Vesperian resonance has never been tested under combat conditions." Another blast rocked the station. Reed made his decision, stepping forward to take Nirala's offered hand. Where their skin met, he felt an electric tingle that seemed to connect him to something vast and powerful. "I hope your people are ready for some very rapid cultural exchange," he said, trying to keep his voice light despite the gravity of the situation. "My people have been ready for centuries," Nirala replied, her scales now pulsing with a brilliant light that filled the chamber. "It's time to show the Concordiate why they were right to fear our union." As the ceremony began, Reed felt himself drawn into a consciousness larger than himself. Through his connection with Nirala, he could sense the station's quantum fields, the approaching enemy ships, and possibilities that defied human understanding. The Chamber of Harmonies sang with energy as two very different species began a union that would change the course of galactic history. What had started as a diplomatic accident was about to become either their greatest triumph or their last stand. And somehow, holding Nirala's hand as space itself seemed to bend around them, Reed couldn't bring himself to regret any of it. The universe seemed to hold its breath as human and Vesperian energies merged within the Chamber of Harmonies. Reed felt consciousness expanding beyond anything he'd ever experienced, his mind touching realms of reality he hadn't known existed. Through his connection with Nirala, he could sense the quantum fabric of space itself, vibrating with possibilities. "The Concordiate vessels are charging their main weapons," Solara reported, her voice seeming to come from both everywhere and nowhere at once. "Their energy signatures are off the charts." But Reed barely heard her. In this expanded state of awareness, he could feel Nirala's presence guiding him through the complexities of Vesperian resonance. Their joined consciousness reached out, touching the station's defensive systems, then extending further into space itself. "Thomas," Nirala's thoughts brushed against his mind. "Do you understand what we must do?" He did. Somehow, in this merged state, he comprehended exactly how their combined energies could affect the quantum substrate of reality. Together, he responded, no longer sure if he was speaking aloud or through their connection. The Concordiate ships fired, their energy weapons lancing toward Nexus Station with enough power to shatter a small moon. But as the beams approached, something extraordinary happened. The space around the station began to shimmer with patterns that matched Nirala's scales, creating a resonance field unlike anything either species had seen before. Through their shared consciousness, Reed and Nirala wove human intuition with Vesperian quantum manipulation. The enemy fire didn't just deflect, it transformed, the energy redirecting itself through patterns that reminded Reed of Earth's aurora borealis. "Impossible." High Marshal Drakatha's voice crackled through the station's communications. "Their defensive field is operating on principles that defy our understanding." "Perhaps that's because you never truly sought to understand," Nirala projected her thoughts across space, her mental voice carrying the weight of centuries of Vesperian wisdom. "You were so focused on keeping species apart that you never imagined what they could achieve together." The Chamber of Harmonies pulsed with increasing power as more Vesperian ships arrived, their crews instantly connecting to the expanding resonance field through their natural quantum sensitivity. Reed felt his human consciousness acting as a bridge, somehow allowing the Vesperians to achieve levels of harmonization they'd never reached before. "Their entire fleet is trapped in a quantum resonance loop," Solara announced, her technical interfaces struggling to process the data. "The human neural patterns, they're acting as a catalyst, exponentially amplifying our natural abilities." Reed could feel the truth of it. His human brain's unique way of processing reality was combining with Vesperian quantum manipulation in ways that created entirely new possibilities. The Concordiate ships hung motionless in space, their crews experiencing a fraction of the cosmic awareness that he and Nirala now shared. "This is what you feared," Reed projected toward the Concordiate fleet, understanding flowing through him. Not just an alliance between our peoples, but the emergence of something entirely new. Something that would make your divide-and-conquer strategy obsolete. Through their connection, he felt Nirala's approval and something more, a deep personal warmth that transcended their biological differences. What had begun as a diplomatic accident had evolved into something profound, both politically and personally. The chamber's energies reached a crescendo, and for a moment, everyone in the sector, human, Vesperian, and Concordiate alike, experienced a glimpse of unity consciousness. In that instant, the artificial barriers between species seemed absurd, like lines drawn in sand before an ocean tide. When the moment passed, the Concordiate fleet began a rapid retreat. But the changes that had been set in motion couldn't be undone. The quantum resonance field had affected everyone it touched, leaving behind an understanding that would reshape galactic society. As the emergency subsided, Reed felt his consciousness gradually returning to normal human parameters. He found himself still holding Nirala's hand, her scales now shimmering with colors he somehow knew represented joy, triumph, and something that could only be described as love. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that wasn't exactly the traditional unity ceremony I was briefed about." Nirala's scales rippled with amusement. "I believe, my dear ambassador, that we may have just redefined the very concept of unity." She paused, her expression turning serious. "Are you ready for what comes next? Our peoples will never be the same after this." Reed looked at their still joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt now. "I think that's exactly what both our peoples need. Besides," he added with a smile, "I'm rather looking forward to a lifetime of redefining possibilities with you." Around them, the station hummed with newfound energy as human and Vesperian crews began working together with unprecedented synchronization. The accident that had started it all now seemed less like chance and more like destiny, though Reed suspected the universe might have been laughing at them all along. One standard year after the events at Nexus Station, Ambassador Thomas Reed stood beside First Speaker Nirala on the observation deck of the newly constructed Harmony Center. The massive structure, floating in neutral space between Earth and Vesperian territory, represented everything their unexpected union had achieved. Below them, mixed crews of humans and Vesperians worked together, their movements synchronized with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Reed watched as his wife's scales shifted through patterns that he could now read as easily as human expressions: current pattern, contentment with a touch of pride. The latest resonance enhancement trials exceeded all expectations, Nirala said, bringing up a holographic display. Human intuition combined with Vesperian quantum sensitivity has opened doors we never knew existed. The Concordiate's defeat was just the beginning. Reed nodded, remembering how quickly things had changed after their improvised unity ceremony. The quantum resonance field they'd generated had done more than just defeat an enemy fleet, it had sparked a revolution in interspecies cooperation. The United Council's latest report shows a 300% increase in human psychic sensitivity, he added. Apparently, prolonged exposure to Vesperian resonance patterns is awakening latent abilities in our species. Did you ever imagine our little diplomatic accident would lead to human telepaths? Nirala's scales flickered with amusement. About as much as I imagined falling in love with a human, she replied, her hand finding his. Though I'm still not convinced it was entirely an accident. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of second speaker Solara, her scales bright with excitement. The first joint fleet trials are complete, she announced. The human Vesperian hybrid ships performed beyond all projections. The quantum drives respond to human intuition even better than our theoretical models suggested. And the Concordiate? Reed asked, though he already knew the answer. Still maintaining their isolation, Solara reported with a ripple of satisfaction in her scales. But their influence wanes daily. 3 more species have requested membership in the Harmony Accords. Reed felt Nirala's satisfaction through their now permanent mental link, another unexpected side effect of their union. The Harmony Accords, drafted in the weeks following the Nexus Station incident, had transformed the political landscape of known space. What began as a simple trade agreement between humans and Vesperians had evolved into a new model of interspecies cooperation. The first generation of human Vesperian children will be ready to enter the academy next cycle, Nirala said softly, her scales shifting to the deep blue of contemplation. Our geneticists say they're showing signs of both species' strengths, with none of the complications the Concordiate warned about. They were wrong about a lot of things, Reed mused, watching a group of human scientists working alongside Vesperian resonance masters in one of the research bays. The two species moved in perfect harmony, their movements guided by the station's subtle quantum field. A chime announced another arrival, third speaker Vena, accompanied by a delegation of Earth's leading quantum physicists. The new hybrid transportation network is ready for its first test, she announced. We believe the combination of human navigation intuition and Vesperian quantum manipulation will reduce interstellar travel time by 80%. Reed felt Nirala's excitement match his own. The network represented everything they'd fought for, the true integration of their species' strengths, creating something greater than either could achieve alone. Shall we begin the test? Vena asked, her scales flickering with anticipation. Reed looked at Nirala, who nodded. Together, they followed the delegation to the control center, where human and Vesperian operators waited in harmony. As they initiated the test sequence, Reed reflected on how far they'd come from that first accidental touch in a diplomatic reception. The test was a success, of course. But more than that, it was a symbol of everything their union had made possible. As celebrations broke out across the station, Reed pulled Nirala close, their minds touching in that special way that still amazed him. Do you ever regret it? He asked quietly. Taking a chance on an accidental diplomatic incident. Nirala's scales shimmered with the pattern he'd come to recognize as love. The only accident, she replied, was that it took our species so long to find each other. Everything else was destiny. As they stood together, watching their combined fleets testing the new transportation network, Reed couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best diplomatic solutions came not from careful negotiation, but from accepting the unexpected turns of fate. Their accident had transformed into something beautiful, a union of species, minds, and hearts that would reshape the galaxy for generations to come. High above them, the stars seemed to shimmer with new possibilities, as if the universe itself was celebrating the harmony they'd found. In the end, it wasn't about humans or Vesperians, but about the endless potential when differences became strengths and accidents became destiny.